Welcome, everyone. Hope you all had a good weekend. I had a one of the rare relaxing weekends. I did my chores on Sunday, but on Saturday I just kind of goofed off. And sometimes you got to goof off to kind of keep sane. That was my Saturday. And so yeah, we're back at it today. Before we get started, I want to make sure that I have some updates for you on where we stand as far as the course. Generally, so far, I think everything's going pretty well in the course. I have not tried to drill down on the grade yet, but I do know that my grader has left notes for anybody who's having incomplete assignments. This is kind of the last opportunity. Please make sure that you check your grades on your homework assignments for the right space and see that you've got complete grades. If you are missing something, my grader's been really enthusiastically saying that if you missed something or forgot to submit something, submit it and you can still get points for it. And this is kind of the last chance, because once we get past that first exam, I'm not going to allow you to go back and fix anything. So please make sure you do that. Keep in mind that even if it's only 1 or 2 points, that full completion of homework is one of those things that you have to do to get out of taking the final exam. And trust me, that's a reward well worth taking, because I'm sure you all are going to be busy with other final exams. And why take the final exam in here when you don't have to? It's just now, if you're one of those people that really enjoys exams and you really want to take that final exam, that is still an option available to you. You're not required to opt out of the final exam, but it's nice to have that option. Yeah, so please make sure we're aware of that. If you have any questions or any concerns about where you stand as far as assignment grades to so far in the course, please let me know. I'm going to probably take a look at those over spring break and make sure that I have a detail of where we're at as far as everything. But talking to my GTRA, he seems to think that everything's going pretty well, and I trust his judgment. So kudos to you guys for doing that. It's good to make sure that everything's up to date. Today is, like I said, is going to be a short activity because we're just going to be going over homework. This is the last homework assignment before we go to exam. Our exam review is on Wednesday. I know I've mentioned this on Friday, but I want to reiterate exactly what will happen on Wednesday, since I don't think anybody in here, well, that's not true. I've got a few students joking on. Basically, what will happen is on Wednesday, I will bring out the study guide. I will go through the study guide. Not in rigorous detail. I will cover some of the things. If there's anything on the study guide that you are unclear about or need clarification about, if I don't cover it, please raise your hand and let me know. So come prepared to ask questions during class. We will then go over the practice exam. I strongly recommend that you come to the class having completed the practice exam in advance, because that will actually tell you where you stand as far as preparation for the regular exam. The practice exam is very similar in format. Actually, in format, it's identical. It's going to be 20 multiple choice questions and 1 problem. So that's going to be very consistent. Breakdown is also very similar as far as the number of questions for each chapter. There are some Excel questions. There's some questions about NetSuite as well. We'll talk about that in more detail when we get to the study guide, but you might want to be very aware of that. So I, again, recommend doing the practice exam in advance. Exams on Friday in here, you'll have 50 minutes, and I'll give you some details on that, but plan on being here early and ready to go, pencil and eraser. I don't recommend taking exams in pen because you may want to change your mind, and it's very hard to do that when you write things in pen, especially if you change your mind again and go back to your original answer. That's happened a few times for somebody who said, no, my original answer, they crossed it out, they wanted to circle it again, and it got really confusing trying to convey that message. So pencil and eraser. All right, homework today. Got some fairly straightforward questions. We're going to get through this, and then everybody's going to enthusiastically leave class and start studying for the exam. That's my anticipation. It's my goal. So we have our standards. Question number 1: which of the following is an activity in the conversion process? Again, these are really easy questions to start out with, and you probably will not see something like this on the practice or on the exam itself. But I do think it's worthwhile making sure you can delineate what's in each of the process areas. So at the very minimum right now, you should be able to know what are the basic activities in the revenue process, the basic activities in the purchasing process, and the basic activities in the conversion process. So let's just go ahead and go through each of these and make sure we understand if they're part of the conversion process. And again, conversion process, manufacturing of inventory is the way to think about that. Authorized production, what do we think? Yes or no? Yep. Issuance of raw materials, sure, we need something to work with. Performing the work, absolutely. It's where you issue the labor and that overhead. Transfer completed work to finished goods. Yep. Once we're done production, we move it out of work in process and move into finished goods. So can we say all of the above are activities in the conversion process? Yes. Also, just as a reminder, we had a little bit of a weird week last week where none of the answers were none of the above or all of the above. All of them are unique answers. We're going to still see that in the homework where all of the above is going to be a possible answer. By the way, on the exam, I will never say none of the above. Okay, I hate questions that have none of the above. I think that's just a cop out. But occasionally, I will have all of the above. All of the above is not always the right answer in the exam. Okay, I joke about it. I say it's the right answer about 25% of the time. The reason there's 4 choices, and so all of the above is going to be correct one out of 4 times. So don't default to all of the above. Make sure you can think through these things. Even though this was an easy all of the above, it's not always going to be the case. Number 2, which of the following activities results in work in process moving to finished goods inventory? So this is actually asking about those transactions that we remember from 221. So which of these is going to say we're done with work in process, now it's a completed good, all right? That was a pretty easy question once we've completed production. That's all there really is to this. We don't need to go through each of the steps here. Again, remember that in the BPMN diagram for the conversion process, you need to be able to identify what are the transactional points at which everything occurs. So just as a reminder, we had a very simple BPMN diagram that we looked at for the conversion process. The most challenging thing about this diagram is making sure we understand what are the transactions associated with these later activities. You should be able to identify what's happening at each of these points. So your BPMN diagrams for all of these are going to include these brackets with the transactions listed below. Also keep in mind that on the purchasing and the revenue BPMN diagrams, even though there's no bracket, you do need to be able to recognize when cash receipts and cash disbursements occur as well. So that's something I'm going to hold you accountable for as well. All right, going back to homework. Oops, not this one. There we go. Question number 4. Which of the following is not a purpose of using lanes to describe the conversion process? This is less of a question about conversion process and more a conceptual question about the use of lanes. So in a BPMN diagram, remember we talked about pools and lanes. Pools represent a separate entity, like a customer or a vendor, okay? When we're in the conversion process, we're not dealing with either of those. We're only depicting lanes. Remember, lanes are different process areas, okay? Different departments, I guess I should say, different departments. So which of the following would be describe the purpose of not a purpose of using lanes in the conversion process? So A says document the sequence of activities in the process. So let's think about this. Do we need to have lanes if we're just documenting the sequence? Do we need to have separate lanes, I guess I should say? No, okay. We've actually got a diagram that doesn't need to use lanes that actually documents the sequence right here. So that would not actually be the purpose of using lanes, okay? That's our answer to the question right here. Let's go through the rest. Pose potential problems in the handoff between organizational units, okay? We know organizational units are departments. We're trying to determine what's going on, what's a problem that's occurring in communication or transactions between units. That would actually be something we'd want to have lanes for. Show important decision points, identify responsibility for those decisions. That could actually be an important point because we'd want to know what area of the organization this is taking place. Establish internal control activities, including the segregation of duties. Segregation of duties can occur across multiple departments, which is really important to note. So yeah, all of these, B, C, and D, could be lanes, but we would not necessarily need to use lanes to describe this sequence of activities. Remember, lanes are going to be vertically represented, whereas horizontal representation is the sequence. That's going to basically be a linear sequence. All right, question number 5. All right, I'm sorry for asking this question. All right, I sincerely apologize for asking this question. This is a terrible, terrible question, but it does reiterate a point that we need to actually get home. So question number 5, which of the following is a business rule implementing access control for the conversion process? You probably saw access control and say, oh, it's something that's due to the employee. So it's actually got to be either A or C, but I'm not sure which. And the answer is actually none of the above. All right. Now you're saying that's shenanigans, Dr. Barnes. I don't buy this. This question is less about identifying the nature of access controls and identifying the nature of business rules. So just as a reminder, the definition of business rules that we looked at are business rules are process constraints that ensure information systems operate in a consistent, effective manner. More importantly, business rules implement internal controls. Now, as a reminder, our business rules, we had 3 categories, okay? We had mandatory or not mandatory, whatever the term for mandatory was. Mandatory, prohibited and or allowed business rules. Okay, and I got the terminology wrong, but basically the same thing. So business rule is saying something has to happen or something should happen, something cannot happen or should not happen, or something may happen in the given scenario. If you look through each of these scenarios, these are all examples of access controls, not rules, controls. The only reason I ask you this question, again, it's a trick question. I would not ask this question on an exam, but the reason I put this in homework is I want you to be able to understand the distinction between what a rule is and what a control. A rule is a general direction for organizational activities. A control is something that prevents or detects and corrects problems with those activities. And so none of these actually represent rules, they represent controls. The first two, or sorry, A and C represent access controls, and then B and D represent application controls. But again, the question was, which of the following is a business rule that implemented that? Is it a terrible question? Yes. But the only reason I'm harping on it right now is because I want you to be able to make that distinction between business rules and internal controls because they are separate concepts. So if you're like, I'm really, really unhappy that you did ask this question and I feel bad, I pride myself on getting accuracy and this is a trick question. You're right, it was a trick question. I don't like this question in the book, but I do think it underlies an important concept. All right, question number 6. Consider a UML class diagram of the conversion process that uses the REA framework. Which of the following begins a typical conversion process? Okay, so this is actually asking about an event, and what should the event be that starts the process? Now, if we think about this from a distinction, a linear distinction, in our previous UML diagrams, whenever we represent our events, they usually occur in sequence. So think about the UML diagram that we did for revenue process. We said that we had quotes, orders, and then cash receipts. And those usually occurred in that sequence. Is that the case for our UML diagram in the conversion process? Not necessarily, not necessarily. Because we know, based on our narrative, that one activity begins the process. And that usually is when we say we have to authorize production. We say there's going to be identification of inventory that we're lacking in a particular scenario. We don't have that inventory. We need to actually obtain that inventory. So once we obtain that, once we actually determine that more inventory needs to be manufactured, that's where production authorization takes place. Now, going back to our diagram of the conversion process, the UML diagram of the conversion process, this is not a linear representation because production authorization is our first step. So why do we put this in the middle rather than putting the top down and issue it that way? There's one really important reason. It's because our other events actually have relationships. Both have relationships with production authorization. So this is kind of a trick question, but not really, because you do need to understand the sequence, but you also need to understand the representation in the UML diagram. Just because this falls in the middle doesn't necessarily mean it's the second event in the process. We're actually depicting relationships and not sequence here. So production authorization would be the answer there. So authorized production would be B. All right, review figure 7-6. Which of the following is the purpose of the labor operation event? So let's go ahead and take a look at there. And we've seen this before. This is our diagram that we were just looking at. Okay. So what's the purpose of a labor operation event? All right. So let's just go through the answers. Let's go through the answers one by one to make sure we understand. Oops. And here we go. Add the cost of direct labor to work and process inventory. What do you guys think about that answer? Kind of like that answer, but let's go through the rest. Control the specific labor activities. No, not really. That doesn't really control the activities. It just basically says that labor operation is occurring. Ensure the labor is performed. Not necessarily. Okay, we're not trying to make sure the labor performed. We're trying to diagram what the activity is represented. Identify production employees. That's a pretty easy, clear distinction that's not going to be included there. Okay. So adding the cost of direct labor and work in process inventory, that was our main step with respect to labor operations and the conversion process, and that's in fact our answer is A. All right, question number 8. Question number 8 is a really interesting question, all right? And this actually made me realize that I've been telling you something wrong early in the entire semester, okay? And because I messed up, this is a point where you can actually make a note of this, okay? Write this down on things to ding Dr. Barnes on his evaluations for, okay? There's an opportunity for that. So we'll talk about why that's the case, but let's go ahead and take a look at the figure that we're going to be looking at. So it actually says, look at this this diagram right here. It says, which of the following is correct posting of a foreign key to implement the model of a relation in a relational database? Now, we've talked about foreign keys. Foreign keys have to be primary keys, but with respect to how we interpret them from a UML diagram, there was something else really important we talked about both in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Does anybody remember what I talked about? Had to have a certain multiplicity that I was looking for, okay? And at the time, I told you it was 1-to-1. I realize today that I lied to you, okay? It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. It could also be 0-to-1, all right? And there's a very easy reason for that, because remember the referential integrity rule says the foreign key either has to have a value of a primary key from another table or it has a value of 0, okay? So it could be 1-to-1 or 0-to-1. The 1-to-1 would say that there's always going to be a value associated with it. If it's 0-to-1, it says is there always going to be a primary key value, or it's not going to have a value at all, all right? So it could be 0-to-1 or 1-to-1, which go back and rehash all of your notes and say, oh, Dr. Barnes is throwing us under the bus again. Yeah, I did, okay. The good news is I'm not going to test you too severely on that. It's not a big distinction, but it's an important distinction to make, okay? So the good news, and also the good news, it doesn't actually, it's not relevant to the question. So here's going to be the way we're going to approach this. We're going to be identifying a relationship where there's a 1-to-1 multiplicity, and that's the one where we would enact a foreign key. So let's go ahead and work through each of these. Labor operations primary key becomes a foreign key in production authorization, okay? So we start with production authorization. We go down to the multiplicity here, see what labor operations relates. So production authorization can have 0 or many labor operations. So is that a 0-to-1 or 1-to-1? No, so it can't be a foreign key, all right? Let's go to the next one. Products primary key becomes a foreign key in bill of materials, okay? So start with bill of materials, go down to here. Bill of materials have to have one and only one product. Do we have a multiplicity that represents our foreign key? Yes, because we have a 1-to-1 multiplicity here, okay? So B is our answer. Just as a note, if we do product categories become a primary key in Sunset Partners. Sunset Partners is just another word for employees. So product categories, employees can have 0 or many product categories. So it's 0 to many right here. So that multiplicity doesn't meet. And then product primary key becomes a foreign key in product categories. So product categories can have 0 to many products. So 0 to many does not meet. All right. Just looking at the UML diagram, we can interpret that. But let's think about this more rationally, because that's not a very, intuitive approach. You're taking on faith that I'm saying that these foreign keys have to have a 0-to-1 multiplicity or a 1-to-1 multiplicity. That's the only relationships that can exist that way. Let's think about this intuitively. So here we have production authorization code, and we're actually going to represent the labor authorization codes. And what do we say? A production authorization can have multiple labor authorization codes. That's what the 0 to many multiplicity has. So it's possible I could have 0 here, I could have 1 here, and then I could have 7 here. Does that defy, or does that violate any of our rules with respect to relational databases? It does. Remember, if we actually, so if I said labor authorization code 23, labor authorization code, leave that blank, and then I say 24, 25, 26, so on and so forth. Can I put multiple values for that individual item into a relational database? No, that was one of the rules that we said about relational databases. It has to have one value within a field. And we're violating that rule, which is why we cannot have this as a foreign key here. This cannot be a foreign key because the multiplicity does not allow it to be a foreign key. Now let's look at bill of materials. This is the one that we said is correct. This is B. This is our answer B. Bill of materials has one and only one product ID. So if for every single one of these bill of materials numbers listed, I've got one product ID listed. Could that be a foreign key? Yes, absolutely, because of that 1-to-1 relationship. If I change this, okay, if I say, let's say there's a 0-to-1 relationship, just for context, to prove a point, 0-to-1 relationship, I could have no product ID there and it would still fit, all right? Both of those are legitimately possible. But for the same reasons down here, I can't have employee and product ID because this employee could have like 10 product IDs that they manage. That defeats the guideline of a relational database having one value per field. So again, it's a really, really important one. It's not easy to interpret, but it's one that we've talked about multiple times before. And the understanding is that we're looking for that 1-to-1 multiplicity, so the interpretation of the UML diagram is really important. There was a lot of focus on that particular question, a lot of focus on this concept to talk about. If you don't understand it, I would try to make sure that you have a grasp of it for the exam, because I've talked about it many, many times, which means that it's likely that I'm going to ask a question about it on the exam. All right. Moving on to our final question. Looking back at this figure right over here, this one's a little bit easier question, okay? Which of the following describes the purpose of the bill of materials class, okay? So bill of materials, We got record the invoice from suppliers for material purchase. We look at the diagram, sorry. That does not appear to be it, okay? Record the planned raw materials contents for each finished good. Well, bill of materials falls between materials and products, which are finished goods category. Does that seem to describe bill of materials? Yep, sure does. So B is our answer, okay? Let's go with the rest. Record the authorization of production. No, there's no authorization of production. The authorization of production would actually be that individual event right here. So there's no authorization of production over here. And then describe the labor required for each finished good. No, this is only dealing with materials. Doesn't actually include labor here. So we can ignore C, D, and A. B is our only one that's the answer. All right. Some discussion questions. The good news about the discussion questions, the discussion questions are actually pretty easy. The question number 3. Question number 3 says, think about the UML class diagrams for the sales and collection process described in chapter 5 and purchase payments process described in chapter 6. So our revenue and purchasing UML diagrams. If you asked to create an integrated model that shows you 2 processes as well as the conversion processes, where would these models intersect or integrate, and why? What are the elements unique to each process? So let's just go ahead and take a look. This is something we alluded to back at the end of the lecture on Friday. Want to make sure we have a note here. So this is our fully integrated UML diagram. It includes the conversion process. And what is unique about this diagram? The unique thing about this diagram is not the individual UML diagrams themselves. It's the fact that it shows the overlap between those 3 diagrams. So we're trying to specify what is the overlap. And we talked about that. We identified 4 activity areas, or sorry, 4 classes. That's what I'm looking for. 4 classes where overlap occurs. So let's just go through these once again. This is your answer to question 3, by the way. This is the answer to that question. What are the areas, what are the classes that overlap? First one is easy. It overlaps all 3 areas. It's our agent that overlaps all 3 areas. Employees, okay? Employees overlap all 3 areas, okay? The next one, a little bit more subtle, but we're going to talk about types of inventory. We're talking about purchase and conversion. What type of inventory overlaps those 2 areas? Yeah, materials or raw materials, however you want to determine that. Distinguish that, okay? Then we have conversion and revenue. What inventory overlaps there? It says products or finished goods. Either of those terms is fine. They mean the same thing. That, okay? By the way, if you say products up here and products down here, you will need to make a distinction for that if I ask you a question similar to this on the final exam, okay? So get in the habit of saying raw materials and finished goods. If you say raw materials and products, it's fine. If you say materials and products, it's fine. As long as you're not saying the same term for both of these, okay? Even if you said something like products before conversion, products after conversion, as long as I understand there's a difference between those, that's all I'm looking for here. All right, and then we have one that has an overlap between purchase and sales, but is not involved in conversion. Which one's that? That's cash. I know it looks like it falls in conversion, but that's because there's no real way to do it. You've noticed cash doesn't have any lines into conversion. We can't actually isolate it to any classes. There's no associations between classes in the conversion process, but it does have associations between the classes in the purchase and sales process. Okay. So that's the answer to question 3 and what you need to be noted. You know, what are the overlaps here? That's what this diagram is documenting. Diagram itself is very, very detailed and specific. Again, I will not ask you to replicate this on the exam, but I will ask you to interpret this on the exam. All right, last question. So figure 7-7, the context of the overall supply chain that starts with the purchase and payment process and ends with the sales and cash receipts process. How would you expand and describe Sunset's entire supply chain? So basically all it's saying is it's taking this diagram, and how would we expand this to include the overall supply chain? Now, there is a very, very easy way to answer this question, okay? If you just simply copy and pasted this diagram here and put this in your answer for the homework, you're done, all right? You could have done that, and I would have said, yep, you can technically answer correct. Now, or you answered correctly, and that's sufficient for me. Let's talk about what it's actually looking for and put a little bit. I'm going to show you the answer that the book shows as well. I don't want you to fixate too much on what the book has because this is a conceptual question rather than a diagramming question. But I want you to understand what the distinction is. So when we're asking about the supply chain, we're asking about, all right, what resources, events, and agents do we need to include to show the entire flow of inventory from inception to sale, okay? Now, we note the conversion process shows the materials conversion from the raw materials to finished goods down here. But do we have any interactions with raw materials before they go into conversion? Yes, we do, okay? We already know that because we know that we have to acquire these raw materials through purchases from suppliers, okay? So we'd want to include that in our supply chain diagram to show that we're purchasing these raw materials from our suppliers. Now, I want to make a note here. If you included this as your picture for this diagram, technically speaking, cash disbursements is not part of the supply chain. We would need to pay our suppliers, but we don't need to include that in the supply chain diagram. That being said, I'm not looking for that technical level of detail. Again, if you just included this diagram and said, I'm done, right? I'd say that's working smarter, not harder. But generally speaking, with respect to this question, we're concerned about these steps right here, and less about the cash disbursement. All right. To that end, is there any activity that occurs with finished goods after production is finished? Nope, we put it in a warehouse, Dr. Barnes, and it stays there forever, much like the lost Ark of the Covenant. Does anybody even get that joke? Yeah, Indiana Jones. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Raiders of the Lost Ark. The movie that will never be old. Yes. All right. No, what do we do with inventory? What do we do with finished goods? We sell it, okay? So we're actually going to generate sales by selling to customers. So the remainder of our supply chain of these two items right here. If you included cash receipts in your diagram, that's fine, but it's technically not part of the supply chain either, okay? We don't need to worry about that. So the diagram that the book tells is this diagram right here, okay? Which looks very similar to the diagram that we just looked at, except there's a few simplifications, okay? We don't have the cash receipts or the cash disbursements, and they did really, really simplify the associations. But for the most part, all that I'm concerned with is, do you understand what are the classes that would be depicted in the supply chain diagram? That's basically everything conversion process, along with the inception of those and the conclusion of those items as well down here. All right, and with that, we are done for today. We are starting exam review on Wednesday. Again, if you have any questions, if you need any help, I will have office hours most of the day tomorrow, so please feel free to shoot me an email.
Yeah, silly question. Why is bill of material like?
So this is a conceptual structure. So it doesn't really fall within any one of the REA events or REA classes. So the reason that we included it in here is just a piece of information that managers want to have additional details on. So we can't really say it's a resource, it's not an event, it's not an agent, so it doesn't cleanly fall within one of our categories, which is why it's depicted. Basically, that's true for any conceptual structures. They will offset it in the UML diagrams to show that it's not a resource event. Good question.